I'd like to read to you from Luke chapter 20, verses 27 down through 38. Some Sadducees who deny that there's a resurrection came to Jesus and asked, "Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother die leaving a widow but no children, the brother must marry the widow and raise up the children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers. The first man married a woman and then died childless. The second and then the third brother married her. Eventually all 7 married her, and they all died without leaving any children. Finally, the woman died too. In the resurrection, whose wife will she be? All 7 were married to her." Jesus said to them, "People who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage. But those who are considered worthy to participate in that age, that is, the age of the resurrection from the dead, won't marry, nor will they be given in marriage. They can no longer die because they are like angels and are God's children, since they share in the resurrection. Even Moses demonstrated that the dead are raised. In the passage about the burning bush, when he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, he isn't the God of the dead, but of the living. To him, they are alive." Now, in our story today, let me set the stage of what's going on. We are in Jesus' last week of his life. He is in Jerusalem. And if you recall that story, Jesus makes this triumphal entry into Jerusalem, and he causes a great stir because people were saying things like, maybe this is the promised Messiah. And so people were talking. A lot of things were going on. Some people were happy and some people were uncomfortable. Well, in this last week, Jesus had a series of controversial discussions with the religious leaders, where they were asking him questions and kind of trying to put him on the spot. And there's just a series of those kind of encounters going on. And that's what we have today. We have one of those controversies. Now, usually when we think about Jesus having controversy with religious leaders of his time, it was the Pharisees, wasn't it? Well, today it is another denomination of the Jews. Today, we notice in the first verse that we read, verse 27, that it's the Sadducees. And the story starts out today by saying, some Sadducees who deny that there's a resurrection came to Jesus. Okay, let's think for a couple of minutes about the Sadducees. Who were the Sadducees? The Sadducees were among the wealthy people in Judaism. And they were among the movers and shakers in Jerusalem. They owned a lot of real estate, and they were wealthy. They had connections. The priests in the temple were Sadducees. So now think about that. The priests in Judaism at that time would kind of be like the Pope and the cardinals with the Catholic Church today. So they were the big guys. Now, you've heard me say before that, of course, the Roman government ruled Judea, and a lot of the patriotic Jews, hated that. They wanted the Romans out. But the Sadducees had figured out how to kind of get along with the Romans, and so they had a lot of connections politically. Life was pretty good for the Sadducees, and they hung out with the Roman officials and went to their parties, and I guess probably went out to the country club and played golf with them, this kind of thing. So these were connected people. Now, theologically, the Sadducees were very different from the Pharisees. You know a lot about the Pharisees because we talk about them so much. Well, the Sadducees, a couple of things about them theologically. Number one, they only believed in the first 5 books of the Jewish Bible, what's called the Torah. The Pharisees believed in all of the Jewish Bible, what we call the Old Testament. But the Sadducees only believed in the first 5 books. I kind of hold on to that because I'm going to come back to that later in my remarks. The other thing about the Sadducees was that they did not believe in the resurrection, as we see from the first verse that we read today. So the Sadducees only believed in the here and now. They didn't believe about any life beyond. That makes them very different from the Pharisees. The Pharisees believed all of the Jewish Bible plus the traditions through the ages, and they did believe in the resurrection. So in many, many ways, Jesus would have been more like the Pharisees and like the Sadducees theologically. Now, of course, in terms of interpretation of the Scripture, Jesus and the Pharisees had a lot of differences. But he was really more akin to the Pharisees than the Sadducees. And so what we have today in this story is the Sadducees trying to put Jesus on the spot about the doctrine of the resurrection. And the way they do this is they give him a ridiculous riddle. It's absurd. And I would just imagine that probably the Sadducees had used this riddle a lot in arguing with the Pharisees. And the Pharisees didn't have an answer for it. And so when the Sadducees told this, kind of picture them kind of, man, this is a good one. We'll get Jesus on this one. You know, we'll put him down on this Pharisee or this resurrection nonsense. And so here's how it goes. Here's how it starts out. Verse 28. Here's the question they ask. Teacher, Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies, leaving a widow but no children, the brother must marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now, they are quoting something from the Jewish law, and this is found in Deuteronomy chapter 25 and verse 5, and it's also referenced in Genesis chapter 38, verse 8. Of course, this would be the Torah. So this is the Bible that they would have accepted among the first 5 books. Now, before you can understand this riddle, you have to understand this law. This is the law of the levirate marriage. And here's how it goes. If a Jewish man gets married, doesn't have any children, and dies, then the law said that that man's male next of kin, his brother, was to marry that woman, and the children that she had would be treated as if they were in the lineage of the deceased man. Are you with me? Now, the levirate marriage is not a marriage of love. We're not talking about love here. What we are talking about in the Jewish culture of the ancient world, they believed that if a man died without any male offspring, it was like he was kind of quenched. That was the end of him. And then the other thing that they believed in terms of their legal system was that there were property rights within families. And so if a man died and he didn't have any sons, remember this is a patriarchal society. If he died and didn't have any sons, then that property left his lineage. So we're talking about really business here. And the idea of the levirate marriage was for the brother then to produce children for this deceased brother who didn't have any children, and they would be counted as if they were the deceased man's children, and that would also tie into the inheritance property rights and stuff like that. Okay, you got me? So that's the levirate marriage. Well, the way the Sadducees tell this riddle, they make it stupid. They make it ridiculous. They said, hey, Jesus, here's a man, he got married and he didn't have any children. So you know what the law says. So his brother married her and he died. She still didn't have any children. So another brother married her and he died. She still didn't have any children. And another brother did. Another brother did. There were 7 brothers. And she never had any kids, and they all died. Now, in the resurrection, who's going to be married to her? She's been married 7 times. Yeah. That's stupid, right? In their way of thinking. Jesus answers the riddle. And he answers it in 2 ways. The first thing he says in verse 34, he says, people who belong to this age marry and are given in marriage, but those who are considered worthy to participate in that age, that is the age of the resurrection from the dead, won't marry nor will be given into marriage. They can no longer die because they are like angels and are God's children since they share in the resurrection. Now, before I got up here to preach this morning, Ernie said, don't preach too long. And you all know I never preach too long. Now, I wish that we had this was a big Bible class and we had about 45 minutes and we could ask questions and so forth, because there's so much in this that's interesting that I would like to talk about, the implications of what Jesus is saying about marriage in this life and how that's different in the life to come. That would be like a 45-minute class that would be fun to do sometime. But we don't have time for that. So I'm just going to give you the overarching point that Jesus is making here. The first thing that Jesus says to the Sadducees is this: you are incorrect to think that the next life is going to be like this life. You are incorrect to try to literalize the next life by comparing it to this life. It's going to be different. So you are comparing apples to oranges. That's really what he's saying. Your comparison is not correct. But then he says something else, and I do want to go into this one a little bit. He makes another point. Verse 37. This is pretty neat. Listen to what he says. Even Moses demonstrated that the dead are raised. In the passage about the burning bush, when he speaks of the Lord as the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He isn't the God of the dead, but of the living. To him, they are all alive. Now, here's what Jesus is saying. This is pretty neat. He's saying, I'm going to take your Bible, and I'm going to prove to you that there's life after death. Now, remember, the Sadducees only take the first 5 books, right? The Torah. So Jesus quotes from the Torah. He quotes from Exodus chapter 3. Now, he says, remember the story of the burning bush? And I hope you all remember that story. Remember when Moses went up on Mount Sinai and he has this encounter with God? God reveals himself to him. And there was like this bush that was burning, but it wouldn't be consumed. That's the story he's talking about. And Jesus says, remember in that story that God spoke to Moses? And what did God say? God said to him, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Now here's Jesus' point. This is pretty neat. Jesus says, now listen to what God said. God did not say, I was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That would be past tense, right? He says, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That's present tense. Jesus is saying to the Sadducees, God is speaking that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob are alive. He is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now, why is that significant? That's significant because when God was speaking to Moses, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had been dead a long time. They were dead. But Jesus says he didn't say he was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He says your own Bible proves that there's life beyond this life. And so then Jesus makes the comment by saying, he isn't the God of the dead, but the God of the living. To him they are all alive. And that was the end of our reading. But then the next couple of verses are kind of interesting. Verses 39 and 40. After this, Jesus said this. Some of the legal experts responded, Teacher, you have answered well. Pretty smart. Pretty good answer. And then verse 40, listen to this. This is Luke's commentary on this. No one dared ask him anything else. That was the last controversy that Jesus had before he was arrested. No one asked him any more stupid questions, in other words. Now, you might be listening to this and thinking, okay, now what in the world does this have to do with us in America in the 21st century? I mean, this levirate marriage thing, we don't have anything like that in our legal code. So you got this levirate marriage, you got this riddle about this woman that was married to 7 men, they all died. That is so foreign to us. I mean, how can you even wrap your mind around that? Because we don't live in that kind of a system. So you might be thinking, what in the world does this have to do with me? I want to tell you. This story has Jesus affirming life after death. That's why it's important. This story encapsulates the promise of the gospel. The gospel isn't just about the cross. The gospel is about the cross and the resurrection. The gospel tells us that the grave could not contain Jesus. The gospel tells us that there is victory over death, and there's something beyond here. The gospel tells us that what God has done for Jesus, God can do and will do for us. That's the gospel. The gospel is about life. The gospel is about victory over death. The Apostle Paul was in prison when he wrote the book of Philippians. And he was writing to the Philippian Christians, and he was saying, I don't know what's going to happen. I'm in prison. Maybe I'll die, maybe I'll live. And he said, I really don't know how I want this to turn out. Because if I die, I'll be with Christ. So what is this conviction? If I die, there's something else. But if I live, then I can still minister and be with you. He's believing the gospel promise. And in verse 21 of Philippians 1, Paul says this. He says, living serves Christ, and dying is even better. The old translation said, living is Christ and dying is gain. But I really like the way the Common English Bible does this, because it really kind of says it, explains it better. Living serves Christ, and dying is even better. So what Paul is saying about his own life, if I live, I just want to be Christ to people. I just want to live Christ. And Paul is saying, and I would affirm, and I hope you would too, that that's the greatest life you can live. Do you want to live a life with purpose? Do you want to have meaning? Do you want to live a life that really counts? Paul says, then live serving Christ. It doesn't get any better than that. You want meaning in your life? You want purpose in your life? A purpose-driven life? Serve Christ. Doesn't get any better than that. There is no better life than that. But if I die, he says, dying is even better. There's something beyond here. Folks, I want to tell you that this morning, that's how I want to live. That's really how I want to live. Living is to serve Christ, and dying is even better. So what our story is saying today is this. Don't live like a Sadducee. Don't live just for this life and just hold on to the material. Live like a Christian. Live serving Christ. And when you die, it's even better. And all God's people said, Amen. Will you pray with me? Loving God, we thank you for this story that we've read today in the gospel. This interesting riddle that the Sadducees tried to use to really ridicule Jesus and his belief in life beyond this life.